so much for sticking around to talk about naming today. I'm curious to see if after this talk, if any of those names would still be suggested by those parents. But today we're going to talk about naming, and more specifically, how you can add structure to your naming process in order to reduce subjectivity. So we're going to talk about a lot of things over the course of the next 25 minutes or so. We'll touch on the different types of names. I'll go through how to create your own naming conventions and a brainstorming exercise before finally talking about how you can refine all of those options and get approval and, of course, drive adoption afterward. But before we dive into all of that, I'm going to quickly try and convince you that I have any idea what I'm talking about. So, hello, I'm Sophie, I live in New York, and I am a UX writer, which is kind of like being a product designer who focuses more on language and grammar than things like typefaces and color theory, which also you might have been able to pick up on by the fact that my slides are a little bit wordier than the other incredible ones that you've seen today. So I first started writing UX copy at Lyft, as our wonderful host mentioned. I helped create the first app that Lyft designed specifically for its drivers. I also worked on the major project that eventually renamed most of Lyft's ride types, so more on that in a little bit. I was also the first UX writer at Envision, where I helped name a couple of different products. Envision is, of course, the product design tool that your team has hopefully used at some point. You might also know Envision by its CEO, Clark, and his affinity for puns. And this year, I became the senior UX writer at Condé Nast, where I work on The New Yorker. I've also really doubled down on my submissions to The New Yorker's weekly cartoon caption contest. So if you have any ideas for this week's cartoon, I would love to speak with you later today. And so that's me. I have named products from scratch, I've renamed things, I've decided not to name things, and across all of these different projects, I've learned that naming is really impactful. It's really one of our most memorable attributes, for better or for worse. And a really obvious example of this that people usually bring up is celebrity baby names, where we have everything from Apple to Blue Ivy to Moon Unit. And you know, it's all fun and games until someone gets hurt, which was the case with Tesla's autopilot mode, which has recently come under scrutiny because the word autopilot implies that the driver doesn't need to pay attention. Or with Apple Corps, which is the holding company for the Beatles, and Apple Inc., which is the company, of course, behind your iPhone and MacBook. The two have spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars battling over the trademark for the word Apple. So the good news is that a naming process can not only prevent your product from becoming the autopilot of 2020, it can also do a lot of good for your product, because a great name makes your product more usable by creating a shared, consistent language. So we all know what we're talking about, whether it's a new component in your design system or a brand new app. Names also make your product more memorable because they evoke images and associate concepts, and a great name makes your product saleable by ascribing a label to your new product. Okay, so names are really important. That's our first takeaway today. And more specifically, all types of names are really important, because if you ask me, there are really two main types of names. There are proprietary and common names, and different people call these different things. Some people say like imaginative versus generic, but in an effort to avoid being insufferably meta by talking about the different names for different types of names, I'm going to stick with proprietary and common for today. So proprietary names are the ones that you normally think of as names. They are used for standalone products that are really unique to your company. They're usually trademarked, branded, capitalized, the whole enchilada, and for that reason, they're created in close partnership with your marketing team. Common names, on the other hand, are used for common features, things that aren't unique to your company, maybe photo uploading, file sharing. For that reason, they're usually kept lowercase, they're not branded, they're not trademarked, and they're more focused on describing your product so that users understand what it is with very minimal context. And for that reason, you'll want to create this name in close partnership with your support team. And while proprietary names are new and fun and exciting, in fact, most products and their names don't need to be proprietary, or capitalized for that matter. Because when it comes to naming, one of the hardest things tends to be resisting the urge to turn everything into a proper noun. Because when a word is capitalized without any clear reason why, it's just distracting. Now, the good news is we have a lot of examples of companies that are currently doing this right, like this phrase, trusted contacts, on this Facebook page. Now, in this case, the common name, trusted contacts, will really only appear on the Help Center, but it's still something that the team has agreed on and uses consistently. In this case, capitalization would just be distracting, and the concept of a trusted or emergency contact is really nothing new, so it doesn't deserve its own identity. Dropbox Paper, on the other hand, is a big, fancy, proprietary proper noun. It's capitalized and everything. And while that capitalized word helps the name stand out, it's the product itself that's unique to the company. It really deserves its own identity, and it's different from its competitors. All right, so we've gone over the two different types of names, but when it comes to proprietary names, you could kind of throw any idea out there. So the question is, where do you even start? Thankfully, a man named Jonathan Bell, who is one of the brains behind names like Verizon and Singular, identified a number of different categories of proprietary names in a recent TED Talk. Long story short, you have a lot of options, from the eponymous, which are named after their founders, like Disney and Burberry, down to the suggestive, which are based on real words or combinations of real words, all the way down to the abstract, which are solely based on phonetics. And the thing is, there are really pros and cons to all of these different types of names. Acronyms, for example, like KFC, are especially polarizing. Some teams believe that they can be difficult to understand, they're hard to remember, they kind of feel like an inside joke sometimes. But in KFC's case, it worked in their favor because they were able to hide the word fried as their customers started moving toward healthier food options. Recently, there's been a big trend toward suggestive and descriptive names. So for example, Google names all of their products using this kind of naming convention. The names of their products are literally exactly what you're getting out of them. These names are really easy to translate, they're really easy to adopt, they require almost no explanation, but at the same time, they're really difficult to own because these are words that basically everyone is using in their day-to-day conversations. But in the end, again, pros and cons to all of these different types of names. The thing is, all of these different types of names are important, whether or not they are proprietary, common, or capitalized. Okay, so we've covered the different types of names. Now let's say that you are working on a product and it definitely needs a name. Opportunity strikes. What now? So this used to be the moment when I would frantically schedule a meeting with way too many people, only to walk out of the room, usually about 20 minutes later, panicking because my boss loved the name Apple. Totally been there. So this brings us to our next takeaway for today, which is that in addition to naming being really important, it also requires structure. Because before you get to brainstorming, you've got to set yourself up for success. If you don't know what you're looking for, you'll never know when you've gotten there. In today's world, names need to meet an increasingly specific set of standards. They need to work across languages, thanks to the internet. They've got to work across social networks and search engines, in addition to just sounding right. So in order to add structure to your naming exercise, you've got to follow a process, like this one. Now, you'll notice that these steps should seem really familiar. Like much of UX writing, the process is really grounded in design. So what we're going to do is talk about how we've shaped these steps to naming in particular, starting with the very first one, laying a foundation, which in this case means naming conventions. Now, if you don't already have naming conventions, this is basically where you want to create a bank of all of the different types of names that you currently have at your company. Proprietary, common, across the Help Center, your app, your websites. And then take a look at which patterns they currently follow, if they do follow any patterns. Are they nouns or verbs or phrases? Are they suggestive? Are they abstract? And then take a step back. Are those names and those patterns working for you? And more importantly, are they working for your users? What you're looking for at the end of this exercise are the types of patterns that you should be following moving forward, whether you're looking for descriptive nouns but not verbs, or maybe phrases but not acronyms. It does take time, but naming conventions should basically serve as a North Star for all of your products to come, so that you'll know that those names not only work for your users, but they also work nicely together as well. So this is actually exactly what we did when I worked at Lyft. When I first joined Lyft in 2014, hence this very outdated branding, we had about 100 employees. We only operated in California, and we offered just one type of ride. You basically tapped a button. If all went well, a car would arrive in minutes, and we called it a Lyft ride. Pretty simple. By the time I left the company about 4 years later, we had added, I think, around 7 different ways to ride. Depending on your city, you could request a car seat, a ski rack, a black car. Things got really complicated, and more importantly, the list in our app was getting really long, and new users didn't always understand things like if you requested something called a line ride, that meant that you would be sharing the car with other passengers. So we realized that we really needed to reassess our names, and I got to see how Jen Chen, who is the original creator of the Lyft Voice, kicked off this extensive renaming process, starting with naming conventions. And as time went on, I had the chance to take over that project on her behalf. So by sitting down and deciding that we would need to switch from suggestive names to descriptive ones, we were able to get Lyft to its current point, where we renamed Lyft Line Lyft Shared, along with a handful of other adjustments. All right, so those are naming conventions. At this point, it's time to create a brief, again, just like you would for a design process, but you'll want to really zero in on a few sections in particular, and I'll quickly go over those. The first one is your context. Where exactly is this name going to live? How will it be used in a sentence, both verbally and when it's written down? You want to identify all of those different places. Next, what is the scope of this project? Not only now, but in the future. Could this feature or product evolve into other functionalities? Could it grow into other industries? Try to think as far in the future as you possibly can. And then, of course, you need to identify your competitors, especially if you're hoping to own or trademark this name. This is a good time to loop in your legal team, if you haven't already, to figure out how much overlap you're comfortable having. And even if you're not trying to own this name, if you're going for a common name, it's also a really good idea to do some competitive research because you'll get a sense of whether there's an industry standard term already out there, and if you want to go with the grain or against it. Now, by answering these 3 questions, it should be a lot easier to identify this last one, who should be in the room during these brainstorming sessions. You'll have a better idea of whether marketing should be playing a big role versus support versus legal, and by identifying exactly who should be in the room and why, you can really help reduce the amount of subjectivity that goes into naming. All right, so these are all sections that should be covered and answered in your brief. And now you can schedule that brainstorming meeting, except no one will suggest the name Apple because you have a brief handy that very conveniently points out that that would cause major trademarking concerns. Now, there are about 1 billion different ways to run brainstorming exercises. I'm sure all of you have probably tried most of them. Personally, my favorite option involves Post-it notes because, of course, it does. So I like to set a timer for 2 minutes, and ask everyone to write down as many ideas as they possibly can. This is blue sky territory, because honestly, the first few dozen names that you come up with are probably going to be the same exact ones that your competitors came up with anyway. So really, the more names, the merrier. Dozens, hundreds even. And then you get to do your best impression of Charlie Day from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia and take all of those ideas and stick them on the wall. You're looking to group them by any duplicate names, common themes, common ideas, to identify your entry points. Now, I'm going to take us on a little bit of a detour here and say that it can also be interesting at this point to look for overlapping sounds. So let's say, for example, you're working on a product that cleans something up. Some of the names that are words that people might come up with: sweep, wipe, dust. A lot of these like SW, WIFT types of sounds. And if you are going for an abstract or inventive name, these common sounds can generate a ton of possibilities. This is actually how the Swiffer got its name. And if you're not familiar with a Swiffer, it's basically like a 2-in-1 broom mop situation that's pretty common in the US. And so the Swiffer was actually named by a firm called Lexicon, which has also come up with major names like BlackBerry and Dasani. And Lexicon, as they explained in their profile in The New Yorker, is really into this concept of sound symbolism, which is the idea that certain sounds basically invoke the same types of ideas, whether you live in Stockholm or Tokyo or New York, no matter what type of language you speak. So by tapping into these different types of sounds, that can really help generate some new ideas and themes to look into. And while sound symbolism probably shouldn't be the sole driving force behind your naming exercise, it can really help generate some new possibilities. All right, so back to brainstorming. Oh, and also, when it comes to sound symbolism, V normally invokes sound, the meaning of like vitality or of liveness. B and T normally imply things like reliability. Okay, so now back to the brainstorm. So after that meeting, once you've synthesized all of those ideas, and of course the entry points, and then maybe shared that spreadsheet back out to everyone in the group, it can be helpful to give everyone some time to really tap into those entry points on their own. It's a good way to kind of take that group hive mind and give everyone a chance to dive into those different ideas with a little bit more intention. All right. And then you'll move right along to refinement. So after you've given the group a chance to not only dig into those entry points, but also make a case for some of their options, maybe over a meeting, it's time to vote. And the emoji are optional, of course, but personally it's how I tend to do it. Now this is the moment where you get to see if there's any sort of alignment across the group. Are people really leaning into one specific name, or is everyone kind of all over the map? And even if everyone is all over the map, it's okay, because it's really rare to have your entire group fall in love with one name at first sight. The important thing is that this phase doesn't drag on for too long, because it's exactly where people tend to get stuck. The important thing is that you want to keep everything moving forward, and if you are feeling stuck, you have a few ways to do so. You can reach out to maybe your operations or support team to get a fresh perspective. You can try another brainstorming exercise or a new entry point. But really the most common tactic at this point is to run some research and get a pulse check on your naming options through some user testing. I would just like to point out that especially with naming, it is very important to consider research a data point, not a decision, because there are so many other factors that come into naming. There's so much vetting that you need to do on top of that, which brings us to our next point, which is the final stage of refinement, stress testing. Now this is basically when you take all of the options, normally around 3 to 6 at this point, and look at them as though they are applying to become an astronaut or like date your best friend or something. You really want to make sure that they fit all of the restrictions that come with naming. So a few of the categories that you'll want to check for, and especially if your name is public or marketing heavy, a few of the categories that you'll want to look into, first is literacy. So again, how does this name sound when you say it out loud and write it down? Are people misunderstanding it? Are they misspelling it? How is this going to sound when your sales reps use it on a phone call? Next, you'll want to check for size. Again, looking back to the brief that you originally created. Does this name fit the current scope of this product? And does it leave room to grow over time? Think as many years in the future as possible, referring back to your scope. Because if you don't leave enough room for this product or feature to grow over time, you'll probably have to make adjustments in the future, which is exactly what MailChimp just did during their major rebrand last year. They ended up making the C in their name lowercase because they wanted to de-emphasize their name's component parts, because they now offer so much more than just email. Universality when it comes to vetting is a big one. Of course, you want to make sure that your names don't translate into anything funky in another language. There are a million examples of this, most of which I probably shouldn't say on a stage. But you'll also want to check for the curse of knowledge, which basically means that your name is only understood by people like engineers or power users. This often happens when you are looking for a descriptive or a common name, and your team just kind of wants to stick with the name that they were already using. Really, really common. Finally, these last two tests are most applicable to proprietary names, but They're also the main reason why descriptive names can be so hard to own, especially if you're going in the Google route and naming something, maps or docs, unless you are literally Google itself. So this is when you want to loop in your SEO and legal specialists, if you have them. If not, a quick search should get you off to a good start. What you're looking for is whether things like your domain and your social handles would be available for these names. And also when it comes to legal, you're thinking back to those competitors that you identified in your brief. So it's all coming together. And making sure that there isn't too much overlap when it comes to any of these names and your competitors. All right, so if you've made it through all of these different tests without too many red flags, you have made it through the vetting process. Now, all you need to do is get approval for your name, which, to be honest, should be one of the easier steps in this process because you've already front-loaded and taken care of so much of the heavy lifting. At this point, all you need to do is show your work, your process, your vetting, and your recommendation. That's recommendation singular. I do think one of the keys to getting adoption when it comes to naming is making one recommendation, the one name that really stood out during the vetting process, to give your group kind of an anchor to work around. Of course, you also want to include the maybe 2 to 5 other options that you had identified so that it is a conversation and a group decision, along with the context that you identified, those pros and cons, and how they'll appear in the wild. And when it comes to context, people do this in a lot of different ways. Some people even mock up websites or apps or hoodies or business cards so that you can really bring those names to life. Really, the only thing that I wouldn't include in your proposal is the actual entire brainstorm, just because that tends to be more distracting than anything. I also wouldn't recommend literally crossing your fingers when you make your recommendation, but it does help to have a little bit of luck, because sometimes you'll all agree on one clear winner. A lot of the time, you won't, and that's okay. Because when it comes to naming, it's always going to be some sort of combination of strategic thinking and a gut feeling. It just has to feel right. In the end, you just need everyone to agree on one name, which, given all of the research and vetting that you've done, you will, because you have so many strong, smart reasons to back you up. Okay. So let's say you do exactly that. You've landed on a name, you're feeling good about it, everyone's excited. And it ends there, because everyone is probably going to keep sticking with the name that they were already kind of using, because there's almost always some sort of name that people were using, unless you do something about it, which is why adoption is so important. It's really not a big step, but it's just as important as the others. Basically, all you need to do is shout this name from the rooftops. Make sure that it's updated everywhere, from your wiki to your help center to the website and app itself. You might even make a usage guide to specify exactly how you should format this name and use it in context. Do you put the in front of it or a? Are those words capitalized? So that anyone public-facing is using this new name consistently and has a resource to turn to. And just like that, you'll have finished your naming process, all 5 steps of it, with just a couple of small detours along the way. Now, before we go, I'm going to leave you with just one last thought, which is that this naming process should not be the very last thing that you do when you're working on a new product. Because naming, in addition to identifying your audience and the story that you're telling, also is an early indicator of some red flags. Because if you're having trouble finding a name, it might be an early indication that either your product is too complicated, or it's not a great market fit, or most commonly, that it's in a really crowded market already. Just think of word processing tools. Between Docs and Word and Pages and Paper, it would be difficult to come up with a unique descriptive name in that market. Okay. So we talked about a lot of different things over the course of the past 20 minutes or so. We talked about the different types of names, from the heavily branded to the help center. We went over naming conventions and a brainstorming exercise. Took a quick detour through sound symbolism before diving into refinement, approval, and adoption. And we came across a few takeaways along the way. Namely, that naming is important, it requires structure, and it should never come last. Thank you.